Obviously, the genocide that unfolds as a consequence, and now this is a little bit, I'm stepping outside of the lecture, but just so that you can see an implication. Obviously, a genocide that unfolds as a consequence of indirect biological destruction will look different, right? Will have different, the nature of the genocide will be different. The deaths might be different. The atrocity factor, right? The wow factor will be different, will invariably be different for an indirect, for a genocide that results from indirect destruction than for a genocide that results from direct destruction, right? All of this is safe, all of this is within sort of Lemkin's formulation of the concept of genocide. And I think it's important that the next generation of scholars, you guys are introduced to these ideas relatively quickly so that you can take it as a given, start rolling with the ideas and coming up with your own ideas of how we can better make sense of the idea of genocide. Because the fact is, people are going to continually, groups, not people, but people, groups, government are going to continue to commit the act of genocide. And the only way we can have any sense of preventing it is if we understand how it manifests, right? We have to think like they think, in a sense. All right, I've said that already. Obviously, genocide includes both the deprivation of life and the prevention of life, right? It results in both the deprivation of life and the prevention of life. This obviously would be an act of deprivation, of killing, right? This would be an act of prevention. Okay, so it results in both the deprivation and the prevention. We're preventing life as an indirect means, we're depriving life as a direct means, right? So again, this is sort of Lemkin's seminal foundational account of the destruction of human groups, which is a more rudimentary, a more basic, a more foundational, seminal account of genocide. Not of genocide, of sort of this idea, this burgeoning, sort of fledgling idea of genocide. Okay, Lemkin gives a pretty good example, a really good example, in fact, of what he means. And me being the guy who sort of teaches by drawing, right? I'm a failed artist, unfortunately. I wish I could draw, but I can't. But I think that in seeing some of these concepts represented as images, though you may forget the concept, the image sticks, and you can always sort of work your way back to the concept by deconstructing the image. It's just sort of how I've learned and how I teach. Obviously through video, right? So I want to make a distinction, right? And I think it's very important that you understand, and this will help, I feel, make it that much clearer what genocide is, right? So if you look at an individual human being here, right? Oops, I made that wrong. If you look at an individual human being, and we look at a group, right? Okay. We look at an individual human being, and we look at a group. And now we're talking still of the destruction of human groups. To commit an act of murder, this is what I've written down, right? To commit an act of murder is to deny the individual a right to live, right? So to commit an act of murder, right? To commit an act of murder is to do what? Well, it is to deny, right? It is to deny or deprive, right? Or deprive, right? To commit an act of murder is to deny or deprive this individual, right? This individual of a right, right? The act of murder is to deny or deprive this individual of the right to live, right? And that makes sense, right? When we're talking about an act of murder, the individual who was murdered was denied, right? Was deprived of his or her right to live. I have a right to live. I want to see what tomorrow looks like, right? And I do. If, unfortunately, I leave and someone kills me, then they've robbed me of my right to live, right? So it's pretty easy to understand what the deprivation of life means, right? We see that in murder. Well, it's exactly the same idea with genocide. It's exactly the same as genocide. And this is Lemkin saying this. This is not me saying this, right? Lemkin says, roughly, that the act of genocide, right? Or we can talk about the destruction of human groups, right? The destruction of human groups. So we can talk about genocide or the destruction of human groups either through direct or indirect means is what? It is the attempt to deny or deprive, right, the group, right, instead of the individual now. Genocide or the destruction of human groups is the attempt to deny or deprive the group of a right to live, right? It is the attempt, just as the act of murder, and to be specific, you might say premeditated murder, right? So genocide or the destruction of human groups is the attempt to deny or deprive the group of what? Of the right to live, or the right to exist, right? The group has a legitimate right to exist. As we've seen in the 1933 conference, right? We've seen that Lemkin has formulated this notion of the international crime of barbarity as the attempt to destroy what? A religious group, a racial group, a social group, right? A religious group, a racial group, a social group. The attempt to deny or deprive this group of the right to exist is foundationally wrong. Later, we'll talk about the moral implications of why it's wrong, right? I'm not going to get into that too much. I am a philosopher, so I have to sort of frame my analysis the only way that I know how, in philosophical terms, right? And in philosophical terms, later I'll do this, we'll talk about sort of the normative implication to, or the normative justification for valuing human life, right? Why is it normative that we value human life? And I'll also give you sort of situated in biological terms, right? It's not going to be anything spooky. If you think about it in just biological terms, the attempt to destroy members of a population, right? The attempt to destroy this human group deprives us of the variety, the diversity that would have been a consequence of their offspring, right, and their interbreeding and their sort of marriages and so on, right? That is to regress the human population. So if it's the case that progression is valued in sort of evolutionary terms, and that would be an if that need qualification, then it must be the case that the attempt to destroy this group is fundamentally wrong because it regresses human evolution in a sense, right? So you can construct on some argument, that's just like off the top of my head, but you get the general idea. It's a bad thing, you shouldn't do it, right? That's basically what's being said. Okay, so what ends up happening now is that Lemkin having attempted to formalize these ideas, having attempted to introduce these ideas to various international bodies, finally hits it on the nail, right? So what ends up, let me erase this now. He gets it, right, with this idea of genocide on December 11th, 1946. So on December 11, 1946, the legal committee, right, the United Nations Legal Committee, they said, okay, you're right, Lemkin, you're right. We are going to unanimously declare genocide a fundamental international crime, right? So December 11th, 1946, the legal committee declared, I'll write some of this up. Right? So Lemkin won. He was able to get this idea of genocide recognized, right, as an international crime because what he was able to do, and as you can see from 1933, he worked on this for a long time. 33 to 46, over a decade of his life, he spent formalizing and refining this concept of genocide, right? We have this idea of the destruction of human groups evolving into the idea of genocide. This idea of the criminality of barbarity evolving into genocide. This idea of the criminality of vandalism evolving into this idea of genocide. All of these ideas and many, many more evolving into this idea of genocide, such that on December 11th, 46, the legal committee says, you know what? We agree. Genocide is an international crime. It will be prosecuted, and here's what we're going to do in order to sort of make this internationally recognized.